Tonight, something in this war appears to have shifted. Not on the battlefield, but in the logic of personal security and symbolic boundaries. A strike reportedly reached a location tied to Vladimir Putin's private protection perimeter on the Black Sea, a target long treated as untouchable. If that attribution holds, it is not simply another exchange of drones and air defences. It signals a deliberate test whether Ukraine can puncture the aura of invulnerability around the Kremlin's leader, and whether Russia will answer with escalation meant to shock not only Kiev, but NATO capitals watching the limits of deterrence. The threshold may have moved. In the early hours following the incident, Russian authorities moved quickly to control the narrative. State media described a hostile attack in the vicinity of the Black Sea coast, near infrastructure associated with presidential security. Details were scarce. No images of damage were released, no precise coordinates were confirmed. What Moscow emphasised instead was intent. This was framed not as a battlefield incident, but as an act that crossed into the realm of personal security. Attribution was handled carefully. Russian officials pointed toward Ukraine without presenting technical evidence, a familiar pattern in moments of high sensitivity. Ukraine, for its part, did not immediately claim responsibility. There was no celebratory footage, no operational breakdown, no real-time amplification on official channels. The absence of theatrics stood out. What independent reporting could establish was limited but important. Air defences in the region had been active. Maritime and aerial restrictions along the coast were briefly tightened. Security protocols around senior Russian officials were adjusted in ways that suggested concern beyond routine posture. None of this proved a direct strike on a residence, but it did confirm that something had penetrated deep enough to trigger extraordinary protective measures. This ambiguity is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. In conflicts like this, the line between what happened and what was meant to be understood often matters more than physical damage. And in this case, the message was received loudly inside the Kremlin, even as the facts remained deliberately blurred for the public. For analysts who track this war closely, Ukraine's behaviour in the days leading up to the incident raised quiet alarms. There was no build-up of rhetoric, no warnings, no hints dropped through unofficial channels. In fact, the opposite appeared to be happening. Ukrainian operational messaging slowed. Public claims of drone strikes decreased. Even the familiar rhythm of nightly updates grew noticeably restrained. To casual observers, this looked like a lull. To intelligence professionals, especially within NATO, it looked like preparation. Historically, Ukraine has used visibility as part of its strategy, showing capability to sustain morale at home and signal resolve abroad. Silence, by contrast, has tended to precede operations where surprise and narrative control matter more than immediate recognition. Encrypted communications reportedly increased, reconnaissance assets were repositioned. Activity did not stop, it went dark. This kind of silence serves multiple purposes. It limits Russian preemption, it narrows the window for attribution, and critically, it allows an action to speak for itself before politics rushes in to explain it away. When something finally happens after that kind of quiet, it is rarely accidental and rarely small. What followed fit that pattern precisely. Not a mass strike, not a barrage, but a single event aimed at a place that symbolised something far larger than its physical footprint. And by remaining silent in the immediate aftermath, Ukraine forced Moscow to react first, to define the meaning of what had just occurred before Kiev said a word. That sequencing matters. Because in escalation dynamics, who speaks first often reveals who feels exposed. Every war has boundaries that are never written down. They are not codified in treaties or declared from podiums. They exist because everyone involved understands that crossing them would change the nature of the conflict in ways that are difficult, sometimes impossible to control. Now, personal security of a head of state is one of those boundaries. For years, locations associated with Vladimir Putin's private protection, residences, retreats, transit zones, have been treated as off-limits. Not because they are militarily irrelevant, but because striking them risks reframing the war from a contest between states to a direct challenge to personal survival. That distinction matters enormously in Moscow, where power is tightly bound to the perception of control. If this operation did reach into that protected space, even indirectly, it marked a departure from previous patterns. The target was not a weapons depot, not a logistics hub, not even a command centre. It was the architecture of personal invulnerability itself, the idea that no matter how intense the fighting becomes, certain places remain untouched. This is why governments around the world hoped such a moment would never come. Because once a leader's personal security becomes a perceived battlefield, escalation logic accelerates. Retaliation becomes less about proportional response and more about restoring dominance, deterring imitation, and reasserting fear. What made this episode especially destabilising was its ambiguity. The lack of confirmed damage did not soften the blow, it sharpened it. The message was not, "We destroyed something." The message was, "We can reach you." And in strategic terms, reach is often more destabilising than destruction. By forcing Moscow to confront the vulnerability of spaces it believed were untouchable, the operation, if attributed as Russian authorities claim, challenged a foundational assumption of this war, that no matter how far it spreads, it would never arrive at the doorsteps of the Kremlin's inner sanctum. That assumption may no longer hold. The Kremlin's response was immediate and unusually stark. Within hours, senior Russian officials abandoned the measured, procedural language often used after strikes on infrastructure or military targets. Instead, they reached for a phrase designed to reverberate far beyond Ukraine's borders: total annihilation. Those words were not chosen casually. In Russian strategic communication, extreme language is reserved for moments when the state wants to project absolute resolve and compress decision-making time for its adversaries. This was not a threat calibrated for Kyiv alone. It was a signal aimed outward, at NATO governments, at global markets, at any actor watching for signs of restraint. Calling the incident state terrorism served a parallel purpose. It reframed the event away from conventional warfare and into a moral and legal category that, in Moscow's telling, justifies extraordinary measures. That framing lowers internal thresholds for escalation while preparing domestic audiences for actions that might otherwise be difficult to explain or defend. What is notable is not just what Russia said, but how quickly it said it. There was no extended investigation period, no attempt to downplay the episode. The speed suggested exposure. When a state feels firmly in control, it buys time. When it feels its deterrent credibility has been punctured, it moves fast, sometimes too fast, to reassert dominance. Behind the rhetoric, concrete steps followed. Security postures were tightened. Strategic forces were placed on higher readiness. Cyber activity spiked. None of these actions individually constituted an irreversible move. Together, they painted a picture of a leadership determined to re-establish fear as a stabilising force. But fear cuts both ways. By escalating rhetorically to the outer edges of imaginable response, the Kremlin narrowed its own room for manoeuvre. Once total annihilation is invoked, walking back to measured restraint becomes politically and psychologically harder. The language itself creates pressure to act to prove that the threat was not hollow. And that is where this moment becomes dangerous, because escalation driven by the need to restore personal and symbolic authority is rarely predictable and rarely limited. When Ukraine finally spoke, it did so without theatrics and without retreat. President Volodymyr Zelensky did not issue a denial. He did not apologise. And crucially, he did not cloak his words in ambiguity. Instead, he delivered a statement that reframed the entire episode from an operational question into a political one. Russia brought war into Ukrainian homes. Now Russia is learning what that feels like. This marked a notable departure from Ukraine's earlier communication strategy. In previous high-risk operations, Kyiv often allowed uncertainty to linger, letting allies interpret events while avoiding direct ownership that could complicate diplomatic support. Here, the tone was different, calm, direct, unemotional. That choice mattered. By confirming the logic of the action rather than its technical details, Ukraine shifted the focus away from how the strike happened and toward why it happened. The message was not about drones or coordinates. It was about reciprocity and about challenging a moral asymmetry that had long favoured Moscow. Equally important was the audience. This statement was not aimed primarily at Russia. It was aimed at the international community, especially NATO governments struggling to balance support for Ukraine with fears of uncontrolled escalation. Zelensky's words forced a reassessment. If Ukraine is already absorbing attacks on civilian areas and leadership targets, why should Russian leadership remain insulated by custom rather than law? This was not bravado. It was strategic framing. By speaking publicly, Ukraine removed the option for Russia to quietly absorb the incident and move on. Silence would have allowed de-escalation through ambiguity. Confirmation closed that door. It compelled Moscow to either respond decisively or accept a new norm in which personal security was no longer guaranteed by status alone. That is a profound shift, because wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with precedents. And Ukraine, in this moment, appeared willing to set one that many governments have spent decades trying to avoid. For Vladimir Putin, the most destabilising consequence of this episode may not be military at all, it is psychological. Power in modern Russia is sustained not only through institutions, but through the perception of control over territory, over elites, and above all, over personal security. The image carefully cultivated for more than 2 decades is that of a leader insulated from chaos, unreachable, protected by layers that cannot be breached. That image is now under strain. Whether or not physical damage occurred is almost beside the point. What matters is that the question has been introduced quietly, persistently into the Russian public consciousness. If an operation can reach this close to the president's protective perimeter, what else is vulnerable? This question travels quickly in elite circles. Among security services, it breeds suspicion. Among oligarchs and regional power brokers, it raises doubts about guarantees that underpin loyalty. Among ordinary citizens, it erodes the sense that the war is distant, controlled, and safely externalized. Historically, Russian leadership has been most sensitive to moments when personal authority appears exposed. In such moments, responses tend to be inward-looking and defensive. Purges, reshuffles, heightened surveillance, tightened information control. These are not signs of strength. They are signs of a system attempting to seal cracks before they widen. And there is another risk. When a leader feels personally targeted, even symbolically, the calculus of escalation can change. Decisions become less about battlefield advantage and more about restoring psychological dominance. That is when restraint becomes hardest to maintain. This is why intelligence services watching Moscow are less focused on troop movements than on internal signals, changes in security doctrine, shifts in rhetoric, unusual activity within elite protection units. These are the indicators of a leadership recalibrating not just strategy but self-preservation. As Moscow absorbed the shock, attention in Western capitals, particularly across NATO, shifted to a narrower, more urgent question, not what just happened, but what happens next. This is the phase of a crisis that rarely makes headlines, yet carries the greatest risk. Phones ring late into the night. Intelligence assessments are updated by the hour. Language is weighed line by line because words themselves can become accelerants. NATO's posture in moments like this is deliberately restrained, not out of indifference, but out of an understanding that misinterpretation can harden into irreversible action. What NATO sees is a convergence of pressures. Russia has elevated its readiness signals and intensified cyber and information operations. Ukraine has demonstrated reach and resolve beyond previously assumed limits. And the customary buffers, ambiguity, deniability, symbolic restraint have thinned. The next 72 hours matter because this is when precedent is either reinforced or rewritten. If Russia responds with overwhelming force to reassert deterrence, the conflict risks expanding in scope and domain. If it restrains itself, even temporarily, it tacitly accepts that a new category of targets has entered the realm of possibility. Neither outcome is stabilising. This is the paradox at the heart of deterrence. Escalation can be intended to restore control, yet often undermines it. The more leaders rely on shock and fear to signal resolve, the less room they leave for calibrated de-escalation. And when personal security becomes part of the equation, the margin for error narrows further. What is clear is that the war has crossed into a phase where symbolism, psychology and perception carry as much weight as firepower. Ukraine has signalled that no target is automatically exempt. Russia has signalled that it is prepared to speak and possibly act at the outer edges of its threat spectrum. NATO is watching, calculating, and trying to keep a conflict already defined by unpredictability from tipping into something far worse. This is not the end of a story. It is the opening of a more dangerous chapter. One where deterrence is tested not at the front lines, but in the minds of leaders and the assumptions that once kept certain doors closed. Nothing about the coming days guarantees catastrophe, but nothing guarantees restraint either. And that uncertainty is in itself the most consequential escalation of all.